All right, that started, and you are good to begin. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jimmy Gonzalez. I'll be the judge of this round. So before we get started, let's call the case of the estates of Genesis Petrillo versus Peony Estates and Harper Martini. My name is Judge Gonzalez. Scoring judge, please look to the two bottoms in the lower left of your screen. Remember to keep your audio and video off unless you are told otherwise. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants. This means the only people on the screen right now should be the advocates and me. Can the attorneys please make their appearances?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon. My name is Addison Pruitt, and I'm joined here today by my co-counsel, Ms. Shelby Johnson.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
And Mr. Krish Katari.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
Together, we are advocating on behalf of the estate of Mr. Genesis Petrillo.
Thank you. For defense?
Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Sam Scheidler, along with my co-counsel Rachel Averett and Courtney Trigg. Your Honor, we represent the defendant Harper Martini in today's case.
Okay, and thank you. Just so you guys can know, just little housekeeping functions. Whenever we're going through this, I will, when we're changing witnesses, I'm gonna do a 10 or 15 second break so the scoring judges, and I'm a scoring judge also, so we can make sure we're keeping track of everything. And then we can, as we go, write your names down properly to give proper credit, where credit's due, okay? All right, with that, are there any pretrial matters?
Yes, Your Honor, just a couple of housekeeping matters to attend to before we begin. Seeing as how this is our first time practicing before your court, I'd first like to inquire, what are your preferences regarding sitting or standing during statements?
It's whatever you guys want to do. I know we're at home. If you want to sit the entire time, that's fine. I'll just ask that I know that if you have an objection, raise your hand and say objection, because I know sometimes the audio messes up when someone's talking, just so that I can stop the witness. But it's anybody's preference. They want to stand or sit.
Yes, Your Honor. And can we assume that all exhibits shared to the screen are constructively not to be seen by the jury until they are admitted into evidence?
Yes.
At this time, Your Honor, we would invoke the rule constructively sequestering all witnesses save party representatives. And for the purposes of the rule, we do not have a party representative at this time.
That's granted.
Your Honor, there should be a bench packet that has been provided to you that contains several documents that may be of use to you throughout the course of today's trial, the Midlands Rules of Evidence, case law stipulations, that kind of thing. I'd like to direct your attention to case law Jacob v. Alexander.
Give me 1 second. Let me see if I can get that up. Yes, go ahead.
Jacob v. Alexander simply states that in a battery case, the touching that is necessary to constitute injury does not need to necessarily be physical contact with the individual. For example, a defendant who intentionally introduces a substance into the plaintiff's food or drink has committed battery, even though the plaintiff voluntarily consumed that food or drink.
So noted.
Your Honor, this case today pertains to some contaminated wine. And at this time, I would like to direct the court's attention to Stipulation 9.
Give me 1 second. Okay, proceed.
And Stipulation 9 simply states that all other food and drink present on the night of June 7th was tested, and none of that food or drink tested positive for organophosphates. And at this time, the plaintiff is ready to proceed.
Okay, thank you. Defense, anything to talk over pretrial?
Yes, Your Honor. First, we'd like to invoke Rule 615, which states that all witnesses have been constructively sworn in before testifying.
Done?
Your Honor, we'd also ask that all objection arguments be constructively heard outside the earshot of the jury.
That's fine.
We'd like to ask your preferences as to screen sharing. Would you like us to ask permission before we put either evidence or statements up on the screen for purposes of impeachment, or is it all right if we just throw those up as needed?
You can throw them up. I think we discussed before that whatever you throw up won't be admitted to the evidence, so it won't be admitted to the jury, excuse me. So you can throw them up so we can all see, okay?
Yes, Your Honor. With regards to the record, if something needs to be stricken from the record after an objection, would you prefer that we ask that it be struck? Or should we assume that objectionable material is automatically stricken from the record upon a sustained objection?
You can ask it to be struck.
Finally, Your Honor, we would like to designate Harper Martini as our party representative in today's case.
Okay. Done?
And with that, Your Honor, the defense is ready to proceed.
Okay. Is there any evidence that's been agreed to beforehand that's going to be admitted, or all the evidence would be admitted during trial? Nothing that was
Your
agreed
Honor, as per stipulation 3, exhibits 1 through 10 are pre-admitted.
Okay, just wanted to verify that. Okay. 1 through 10, you said?
In addition to that, since Lonnie Paris is being called, exhibit 11 is also pre-admitted.
Is that correct, defense?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. All right. Anything else?
We have nothing further, Your Honor. We're ready to proceed to opening statements.
Okay. Fantastic. So we will now hear opening statements from each party. Everyone should make sure they are in speaker view. That button is in the upper right of your screen. Attorneys, please remember to mute your audio when the other attorney is speaking. So with that, plaintiff, are you ready to proceed for opening?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, you may proceed.
May it please the court. Harper did what she said she would. Members of the jury, we're here to discuss how this hostile relationship between future in-laws was far from normal. Today, we'll discuss a young man named Genesis Petrillo. A man who didn't get to see his own bride walk down the aisle after drinking a bottle of wine at his rehearsal dinner on the night of June 7th, 2019. An ambitious man with his whole life ahead of him. He had real dreams and goals. He was engaged to a young woman named Casey Soto, and the two had elaborate plans to move to France and start their lives together. But you'll hear about Casey Soto's mother, Harper Martini, the defendant in today's case. Miss Martini is a single parent, and her only real family is Casey Soto. You'll come to find that the defendant was protective over her relationship with her daughter. And unfortunately for Genesis Petrillo, those feelings fostered a hostile relationship that would later cost him his life. You'll come to find that the defendant's protective nature over her daughter was anything but normal. You'll see that from the moment the defendant met Mr. Petrillo, she immediately viewed him as a serious threat to her relationship with her daughter. The defendant was uncompromising and for years did everything in her power to destroy the young couple's relationship. The defendant threatened Mr. Petrillo on numerous occasions, going to abnormally extreme lengths to force him out of her daughter's life. Harper Martini explicitly told Genesis Petrillo that she would take him out of the picture. And you'll come to find that Genesis Petrillo, as well as everyone around him, feared those warnings. You'll see that the defendant followed through on those threats by poisoning a bottle of wine with chemical pesticides and gifting that bottle to Genesis Petrillo on the night of his rehearsal dinner as a peace offering. Genesis Petrillo's life was stolen from him, and it is nothing short of unlawful and unjustifiable. You'll come to find that the defendant's threats were very real. And we'll show you this through the testimony of 3 witnesses. First, you'll hear from Casey Soto, the defendant's daughter. She'll talk about the toxic and malevolent nature of her mother's relationship with her fiance. And she'll discuss the defendant's uncompromising drive to keep Casey from moving forward with her life. Next will be Dr. Jim and Kwan, the chief emergency physician that treated Genesis Petrillo the night he was poisoned. She'll talk about the test that she ran on Petrillo on the night of the rehearsal dinner. And she'll discuss that Mr. Petrillo's symptoms, as well as his test results, correlated with that of pesticide poisoning. Finally, will be Lonnie Paris, a local journalist. He'll talk about how his investigation into Peony Estates led him to witness the defendant's tense arguments with Mr. Petrillo. And he'll talk about how the defendant attempted to bribe Mr. Petrillo as a means of taking him out of the picture. Members of the jury, we bear the burden in today's case. We must prove by a preponderance of the evidence that there was an act by the defendant, that there was intent to cause harm, and that there was harmful contact made to the plaintiff. But I want to bring attention to the idea of harmful contact. That contact necessary to prove that burden does not have to be physical. In showing that the defendant intentionally introduced Mr. Petrillo's wine with a harmful substance, we prove that burden. Today, we must merely demonstrate that the defendant had the intention of harming Mr. Petrillo, and she followed through on that desire by poisoning his wine with chemical pesticides. Today, we'll prove these things by a preponderance of the evidence, because testimony will show that Harper did what she said she would. And at the end of today's case, my co-counsel, Krish Kathari, will come before you, and he will ask you to find the defendant liable for battery.
Thank you. Defense opening.
May it please the court. The plaintiff is telling you a story with the wrong villain and the wrong ending. Members of the jury, when you hear a story, you expect it to have certain parts. You expect to hear about a hero and a villain. You expect to hear exposition, rising action, climax, and resolution or ending. Now, when a story is good, when a story feels true, the ending follows logically from the points of the plot. The hero is truly good and the villain is truly bad. The plaintiff is here today to tell you a story, and they're going to tell that story in the form of a civil battery complaint. That complaint has three elements. They must prove to you that an act occurred, that that act was intended to cause harm, and that the harm intended occurred to the victim. Now, in the terms of today's case, that means that they must prove that Harper Martini put organophosphate pesticide poison into Genesis Petrillo's wine, that wine was given to Genesis Petrillo with the intent of harming her, and that Genesis Petrillo was harmed by organophosphate pesticide poison in her wine. Now, in short, members of the jury, that means that the plaintiff must identify the villain of their story as Harper Martini, and they must show the end of their story as Genesis Petrillo dying as a result of organophosphate pesticide poisoning. Members of the jury, I want you to listen closely to the plaintiff's story today. I want you to ask yourself whether the facts make sense and whether the plaintiff meets their burden of proof. You see, the plaintiff's burden of proof today is the preponderance of the evidence. That means that it rests entirely on their table to prove that it is more likely true than not that each element of their complaint is true. Members of the jury, I ask you to listen and ask yourself whether it is truly more likely to be true than not that Harper Martini is the villain of today's story, and whether it is more likely to be true than not that the story ends with the death of Genesis Petrillo. Members of the jury, you're going to hear from the defense today, and together we are going to show you what's wrong with the plaintiff's story. You're first going to hear about the end of the plaintiff's story. The defense is going to call Dr. Rose Cannon to the stand. Dr. Cannon is going to tell you that in his analysis of Genesis Petrillo's tragic passing, Dr. Kwan, Genesis's supervising physician, overlooked several key alternative causes of death. Members of the jury, you're going to hear from Dr. Cannon that there are several viable alternative possible causes of death for Genesis Petrillo, and that these alternatives, when not looked for and not considered by a supervising physician, make it impossible to conclude with scientific certainty that Genesis Petrillo died of organophosphate pesticide poisoning, calling into question the end of the plaintiff's story. You're also going to hear why Harper Martini is not the villain of Genesis Petrillo's tragic passing. You'll hear first from Blair Osborne, longtime business partner at Peony Estates and Harper Martini. Blair's going to tell you that Harper had no motive to ruin Casey Soto's wedding by killing off Casey's fiance. Much the opposite. You're also going to hear about a long history of Harper Martini and Blair Osborne having a great relationship, and the improbability and even implausibility of Harper Martini killing anyone. Finally, members of the jury, you'll hear from Harper Martini herself. She'll admit that she's not always been the easiest person to get along with, and that adding Genesis to the family was a difficult change to make. But Harper's going to tell you that the thought of killing Genesis never once crossed her mind, that such a thing was unthinkable to her. You'll also hear from Harper Martini about somebody else at Peony Estates. Somebody who did have motive to hurt Genesis Petrillo and Casey Soto, a spurned ex-lover who still worked for Peony Estates, who still had access to the kind of pesticide that's in question today, as well as the wine that may have ultimately caused Genesis Petrillo's death. After today's testimony, members of the jury, it's going to be clear to you that the plaintiff has identified the wrong villain of today's case. I want you to think carefully about the story you're going to hear. At the end of the day, my co-counsel, Rachel Averett, is going to come before you and is going to ask you again whether the plaintiff has demonstrated that they have selected the right villain and told the right ending to their story. Members of the jury, the testimony that you'll hear today will make it impossible to agree with the plaintiff's point of view. You will find that the plaintiff has failed to meet their burden of proof, and that it is far from more likely to be true than not that Harper Martini caused the death of Genesis Petrillo. At the end of today's trial, you must conclude that the plaintiff has told a story with the wrong villain and the wrong ending.
Thank you. Wait about 10 or 15 seconds to allow judges to make their notes before we move on, okay? Okay, before the plaintiff's calls its first witness, I want to ask everyone to switch to gallery view. That button is in the upper right of your screen. This will allow you to see the attorneys and witnesses at the same time. Plaintiffs, please call your first witness.
This time, the plaintiff calls Casey Soto to the stand.
Okay, Ms. Soto. Okay, you may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Casey Soto.
What is your relationship with Genesis Petrillo?
Genesis Petrillo is the love of my life. We were supposed to get married, but he passed away in July of last year.
We're going to talk about that a little later, Ms. Soto, but first, how did the two of you meet?
We met in 2012 at the Rosie and Pedro Winery. I was invited to this party by a friend of mine, and I had to step out to get some fresh air. I got turned around on the property, and I knew I was lost, and he was just there. He was always there for me. We really had something special, but my mom never really thought so.
Why do you say that?
Well, I wanted my mom to love Genesis as much as I did, as much as I still do, but she never approved of us. She had good intentions, but she took things too far.
Can you describe your relationship with the defendant?
Yeah, my mom always said that I was all she had left. She forced herself into pretty much every aspect of my life and just assumed I would be taking over Peony Estates, regardless of what I actually wanted to do. So you can imagine what happened when she finally met someone I was serious about.
Well, how did that first interaction go?
It was awful from the moment they met. In 2015, my mom gave Genesis a bottle of wine, and Genesis, ever the comedian, made a joke asking if there was anything classier. And he had no idea that the bottle came from my mom's winery, and it's been nothing but difficult since then, and even more so when we finally got engaged.
Well, how did the defendant react to the news of your engagement?
My mom freaked, but I told her that Genesis and I would take care of everything. We booked our favorite venue, the winery we met at. He and I were really excited to plan it all out, but our plans were no match for my mom.
What do you mean your plans were no match for your mom?
Right off the bat, things went wrong. My mom heard about our plans and had us change the venue. She actually said she would not only be disappointed, but angry if I chose to have my wedding at the venue that I wanted. I mean, we eventually had the venue changed, but we weren't thrilled about it.
How did the wedding planning go with the defendant involved?
My mom took over everything, the colors, the flowers, the catering, you name it. I mean, she even went behind our backs on numerous occasions on catering and even hiring a wedding planner. The planning of what was supposed to be the greatest day of our lives turned into just being one fight after the other.
What was the arguing about?
Well, my mom was the most hands-on mother of the bride I'd ever heard of. And while I was used to my mom butting in on my life, Genesis wasn't. He actually tried to call my mom and sort it out, but there was so much yelling and screaming, I had to leave.
Did things ever smooth over?
No, not really. Genesis kept trying to fight for the wedding we wanted, but I just told him to try and not anger my mom too much. We just had to make it through the wedding.
Well, what was going to happen after the wedding?
Genesis had a job offer in France, actually. We both really loved traveling and seeing new places, so naturally we jumped at the opportunity. All we had to do was get through this wedding, and then we could have been free of my mom and lived our lives on our own terms.
Did anyone else know about the job offer?
Yeah, Genesis told my mom.
And how did the defendant react to the news that you were leaving?
I have never seen my mom that angry in my life. She kept going on about how someone had to take over the family business and how I couldn't just abandon her for Genesis. My mom was so mad, she actually told Genesis that she didn't care if he went off to France, stayed with me, or ended up 6 feet under, that I was staying in Midlands.
How did you feel about that?
I was terrified. I mean, we both were. I'd never seen my mom that angry before.
Objection, Your Honor. Speculation.
Response?
Your Honor, could opposing counsel clarify as to what would be speculation?
Ms. Soto just said that she was terrified. We both were. While she can say and testify to her fear, she cannot testify to Genesis Petrio's mindset.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Yes, please.
Your Honor, this is the fiance of the person in question. I believe that it is well within the scope of her rationally based perception to be able to testify whether or not her fiance was afraid of someone.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Sure.
If Ms. Pruitt would like to lay the foundation that Ms. Soto saw a certain facial type or heard Ms. Petrio say something that would indicate fear, that would be fine. But simply saying that she was fearful without any context would be speculation.
May I respond to that?
No, it's fine. Objection sustained. Just, sorry, Ms. Pruitt, just rephrase your question and lay some foundation. Let's move on.
Your Honor, can I ask that that portion be stricken from the record?
Yes, please strike that from the record, that last answer to that question. You may proceed, Ms. Pruitt.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Ms. Soto, being careful to stick to only your own perception of the events, how did you feel about that?
I was absolutely terrified. I mean, I had never seen my mom that angry before, and I had no idea what she was capable of. Things just really came to a head the night of the rehearsal dinner.
What happened at the rehearsal dinner?
Things were tense from the start, actually. Genesis showed up late, and my mom said that Genesis shouldn't have bothered to show up, and Genesis made this weird comment about not being able to be paid to stay away. I didn't know what they meant by that. I just knew that this was not what I had in mind when I thought of my wedding. I considered calling the whole thing off.
Well, did you end up calling it off?
I talked to Genesis. I mean, both of us wanted nothing more to get married, but we were also terrified. I mean, we were scared that my mom might try something during the wedding.
Objection, Your Honor. I re-raise my speculation. Objection from earlier. She cannot testify as to the mindset of Mr. Petrio.
Sustained. Sustained. Just asked it a different way, Ms. Pruitt.
Yes, Your Honor.
Can that be stricken from the record as well?
Yes, it'll be stricken for the record, the answer to the last question.
Did you end up calling the wedding off, Ms. Soto?
No, we didn't. At the end of the day, I wanted nothing more than to marry Genesis. And even though I was terrified that my mom might try something, I decided to go ahead.
Were there any other conversations with the defendant that night?
Yeah, there was. I tried talking to my mom about France again. I tried to make sure that she understood that it was my choice to go, that I wanted it. But she just kept saying things like, Genesis is the one behind this, and you can't let Genesis break up our family. No matter what I said, I couldn't change her mind.
Well, how did the rest of the night go?
My mom decided to give a toast, and it was a cruel joke. She got up there and berated Genesis in front of everyone. I mean, the bad blood between them was so obvious. It's why her second toast was so strange.
Strange how?
Well, my mom got up around 10 o'clock and toasted Genesis again, but it was a complete 180 from anything she had ever said before. She even made this really big deal of giving Genesis a fancy bottle of wine that no one else got, not even me, and I'm her own daughter.
Well, I want to talk about what happened the day of your actual wedding. How did that morning begin for you?
My mom came in around 8 o'clock and said that no one knew where Genesis was. She started going on about how Genesis had obviously bailed and we should just cancel the whole thing. It didn't feel right. She was just so ready to call it all off. I had to get her out of the room.
Did you speak to anyone else that morning?
Yeah, I spoke to Angel Rodriguez. I noticed they were in their same clothes from the night before, and I asked why. And that's when I found out that Genesis was in a coma at the hospital.
Were you able to go see Genesis at the hospital?
I actually don't remember how we got there, but we missed it by 5 minutes. We were 5 minutes too late. The love of my life, the man who was supposed to be there for the rest of my life was dead. I just remember collapsing to the floor, feeling like I couldn't breathe.
I'm so sorry to hear that, Miss Soto. I know this might be hard, but what was Genesis's cause of death?
They told me it was pesticide poisoning.
Is there any way that you can think of that Genesis could have been exposed to pesticides?
I've gone over
Objection,
that.
Your Honor. Speculation.
I overruled. The question was if she knows any way, if her knowledge, if she knows anything in her knowledge, why is she exposed to pesticides? I'll allow that question. Proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. I'll ask my question again. Ms. Soto, is there any way that you can think of that Genesis could have been exposed to pesticides?
I've gone over that night so many times in my head. Why he died and not me. I really can't remember or think of anything because, and it doesn't make sense because we ate and drank everything, the exact same thing that night. I mean, we shared everything except the bottle of wine that my mom gave him.
Thank you. I have no further questions at this time, Your Honor. I pass the witness.
Okay, before we begin with defense, about 10 or 15 seconds to allow the judges to do their scorecard. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Defense, go ahead. And please state your name so we can make sure we have it clear on our records.
Courtney Trigg.
Thank you.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
Yes, please.
Good afternoon, Ms. Soto. Now, I would like to start off with what you ended on your direct just now. You stated that you and Genesis drank and ate the same things all night. Is that correct?
Yeah, we shared everything except the bottle of wine that my mom gave him.
But you went to bed early that night, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
So you cannot testify as to what Genesis did or did not drink after you went to bed?
No, I wasn't there.
So you cannot say for certain that you guys ate and drank the exact same thing the whole night, can you?
I mean, once I left, I could have, no, I guess not.
So that's a no to my question.
Yeah, no.
Now, moving back to the wedding, your mother offered to host the wedding, is that correct?
Yeah, she said that she would be really upset if I decided to have my wedding at a winery that wasn't hers. So she had us hold the wedding at Peony Estates instead.
And that is because you originally wanted to host it at her competitor's winery?
Yeah, that's the place where Genesis and I met. We figured it would be a really good spot to be married.
Now, your mother wanted good publicity for her winery, isn't that right?
Yeah, she's a business owner.
Objection, Your Honor, as to the relevance of this question.
Response?
Your Honor, this goes to motive, which is always incredibly relative in every case.
Response from plaintiffs?
Your Honor, I don't believe whether or not Miss Martini would be making money off this wedding is in any way relevant to whether or not she attacked Genesis Petrillo.
Your Honor, my actual question was if she wanted good publicity for the wedding, which makes it less likely that she would act in this way, ruining her business.
Response from plaintiff?
Your Honor, I still don't believe that this line of questioning is in any way relevant or pertinent to any of the facts of today's case.
Objection overruled. You may proceed.
Now, Miss Soto, I'm not sure I fully got your answer. Your mother wanted good publicity for her winery, is that correct?
I mean, she's a business owner, so yeah, she would want good publicity for her business.
And she wanted the wedding to go well?
I believe so.
No matter who you were marrying, correct?
Yeah, yes.
Now, I want to move on to Drew Matsukas, your friend. Now, he originally introduced you in Genesis, isn't that right?
Yeah, he's the one who invited me to the party at Rosie and Pedro.
And you would say that Drew was quite involved in your relationship.
Yeah, the three of us spent a lot of time together.
And they knew Genesis quite well?
I mean, I obviously don't know exactly what their relationship was like, but I mean,
Drew helped Genesis plan your engagement, isn't that right?
Yeah, he did. They did.
And you're aware that Drew Matsukas was a tour guide at the winery?
Yeah, I was. I was at the winery a lot. So
and as such, he would have access to the entirety of the land?
I mean, I imagine so, yeah.
And this would include all places where they make and store wine?
Yes.
Now, let's move on to why you are here today. You were subpoenaed to testify, correct?
Yes, I was.
And you do not want to believe that your mother could have done this, do you?
I mean, of course not. I don't want to believe she would do it. No one wants to believe that their parent would kill their fiance, but I don't trust my mother either.
And while you don't trust your mother, you don't know who to trust, do you?
No, I don't really trust anyone at this point, no.
And finally, Ms. Soto, just to be absolutely clear, you never saw your mother put pesticides into the wine that your fiance drank, correct?
No, I did not.
Thank you. I pass the witness.
Any redirect from plaintiffs?
No redirect, Your Honor. I ask that this witness may be dismissed.
Okay. She'll be dismissed. Give another 10 or 15 seconds, please, before plaintiff calls her next witness. Thank you. Okay, plaintiffs, please call your next witness.
At this time, the plaintiff would like to call Dr. Kwan to the stand.
Please identify yourself for the record.
My name is Dr. Jaimin Kwan.
Okay, and I'm sorry for the plaintiff's attorney. Is it Krish?
Yes, Your Honor.
Krish Kothari? How do you say your last name? I'm sorry.
Kothari.
Kothari, okay. Just so I can write it down on my...
Yeah, of course.
Okay, you may begin.
Good afternoon. Can you please introduce yourself to the court?
Yes, my name is Dr. Jaimin Kwan.
And Dr. Kwan, what is your profession?
Well, I am a medical doctor. I'm currently employed by River Valley Hospital as chief emergency physician. I've been treating patients in the emergency room for a couple of decades now, living my dream to help people.
What educational background do you have to hold this position?
Well, to be a doctor, you need a medical doctorate degree, which I have from University of North Carolina. In addition, I earned a bachelor's degree in biology from Georgia Tech. I completed a fellowship in medical toxicology as well as a residency at Emory University Hospital.
Have you ever been published in your field?
Indeed, I have. I consider it my personal mission to educate the world of dangers of pesticides, and I've written several articles with respect to the subject.
So, Dr. Kwan, why are you here today?
Well, I was the treating physician for Mr. Genesis Petrillo when he presented to the emergency room. I'm here to discuss my diagnosis and findings from that encounter.
What data did you use to actually get your diagnosis?
Well, as any emergency room doctor knows, you have to evaluate the patient quickly and thoroughly in order to come up with a diagnosis. I listened to the patient to determine my treatment plan, and I considered vital signs, physical evaluation, and whatnot. And I approached the case with a knowledge of pesticides and toxins.
Is there any specific method that you used when diagnosing Genesis Petrillo?
Aside from the medical evaluations, yes, there's a gold standard evaluation method for potential toxicology cases called the APATS method. It's an acronym for the Acute Poison and Toxicity Scan. That's a step-by-step method to determine whether or not a patient is suffering from a toxicology event, a poisoning event, and what toxin might be at work in the body.
Was this method sufficient to actually reach your diagnostic conclusion?
Indeed, it is. It was, and I've used it many times in the emergency room.
Finally, did you reliably apply this method to this case?
I certainly did. I'm totally committed to my patients. Yes.
So moving on, what did you observe when Genesis Petrillo first arrived at your emergency room in June of 2019?
Well, the patient presented with nausea, vomiting, stomach pain, slurred speech. Patient smelled of wine, and he was visibly intoxicated. He was accompanied by a companion who said they had been at a party and that there was drinking.
So from there, how did your treatment of Genesis Petrillo progress?
Well, you know, as time clicked off the clock, the patient reported chest pain. And from there, I noted there was excessive tearing, severely contracted pupils, wheezing, incontinence, and muscle spasms. As these symptoms multiplied and everything kind of came more into focus, it was clear that alcohol poisoning was really not the proper diagnosis, especially the contracted pupils.
So what else led you to suspect that it wasn't alcohol poisoning?
Well, there were a number of factors. First, the blood alcohol concentration of 0.16% was really far too low to be consistent with an alcohol poisoning case. And there were just too many symptoms that didn't align with alcohol poisoning, such as, for example, the contracted pupils. Alcohol poisoning means dilated pupils. So this was contracted pupils. And interestingly, certain pesticides are the only commonly used pesticides in the area that would cause contracted pupils.
So ultimately, Dr. Kwan, in your expert medical opinion, what was the cause of Genesis Petrillo's condition?
Well, specifically, the cause was pesticide poisoning. More specifically, the cause was organophosphate poisoning, which is a common agricultural pesticide.
Did you conduct any tests at all to confirm that Genesis Petrillo was indeed suffering from pesticide poisoning?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I did. I ordered lab tests for the blood and as well as the stomach contents of the patient.
Would you recognize those tests if I show them to you in court today?
Yes, I sure would.
Your Honor, as we discussed in the pretrial, in accordance with Stipulation 3, Exhibit 5 is already pre-admitted. Ms. Pruitt, can you display Exhibit 5 at this time? All right, Dr. Kwan. So looking at this test result, can you explain what do we see here?
Well, if you look about midway down in this test report, you'll see that the line item named acetylcholinesterase is flagged with a low reading. So acetylcholinesterase is an enzyme, and enzymes are substances in our body that kind of kick off chemical reactions telling our bodies to do certain things. particularly acetylcholinesterase is attached to the muscles and the nervous system. For example, letting our lungs, expand and contract, and our bronchial tubes to do the same. So if an enzyme isn't working properly, which is never good, it means that something is interfering with it. Something is getting in the way of it, and it's not working.
So is there any chemical that can interfere with this acetylcholinesterase enzyme from functioning?
Yes, absolutely, and that is organophosphate specifically. It's so common. It's so closely aligned to the acetylcholinesterase enzyme that it's considered in the medical field to be really a definitive diagnosis of organophosphate poisoning.
Thank you, Ms. Pruitt. We can take down that exhibit now. Your Honor, once again, with stipulation 3, we have exhibit 6 as being pre-admitted. Ms. Pruitt, can you display exhibit 6 once more at this time? So, Dr. Kwan, can you walk us through these test results?
I can. So as you can see, the first specimen tested on the list is blood, and it was found to contain isofenfos. Isofenfos is the poisonous chemical compound within an organophosphate pesticide. The second specimen was the stomach contents of the patient because he had been vomiting throughout his hospital stay, and there was also isofenfos detected in his stomach contents.
Is there anything else remarkable about this exhibit, Dr. Kwan?
Yes, indeed there is. If you look further down, the findings indicate that the stomach contents were found to contain wine, and that the wine was intermixed with organophosphate, but the non-wine food particles that remained in the patient's stomach, or at least were vomited up, they were all tested, and they contained no evidence of isofenfos involvement, none at all.
So what could this mean, Dr. Kwan?
Well, it means that very likely that the patient suffered from organophosphate poisoning, and that the wine was the only thing in the stomach that indicated that that's what it was.
Is there any other way in which Genesis Petrillo could have come into contact with this pesticide?
Well, sure. There's inhalation and skin contact, but I found no decipherable tissue damage on the patient that would indicate that had been the case. So I find that to be very unlikely.
So finally, Dr. Kwan, what is your overall ultimate conclusion as to the cause of death of Genesis Petrillo?
Well, the distinctive set of symptoms caused the illness of this patient were in line with the lab results, which clearly pointed to pesticide poisoning. In the medical field, we refer to this as a chain death, if you will. So death was linked to respiratory failure, which was linked to the low level of acetylcholinesterase, which was linked to the organophosphate, which was linked to, unfortunately, the isofenfos in the wine that he drank.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Okay, give about 10 or 15 seconds so we can just do our scoring. Defense,
Your Honor, I believe you're muted.
yeah, I'm sorry. Defense, you may proceed with cross. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Kwan. I hope you're doing all right today. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your examination of Genesis Petrillo. Now, when Genesis Petrillo came into your emergency room, you initially suspected alcohol poisoning.
That's correct, yes. Mm-hmm.
And Genesis Petrillo showed several key symptoms of alcohol poisoning.
Initially, you're right. Yes, he did. But then things changed, as they often do.
He demonstrated slurred speech.
Yes.
Loss of ambulatory control.
Yes.
Nausea.
Yes.
And vomiting.
Yes.
And these are all symptoms of alcohol poisoning.
Symptoms of alcohol poisoning and other things, but yes, that wasn't my initial impression. You're right.
Now, Dr. Kwan, it's possible to suffer from alcohol poisoning and other ailments.
Yeah, sure. That's correct.
the presence of other symptoms doesn't preclude the presence of alcohol poisoning.
Not really, but I was given no information from the patient or the companion with respect to any pre-existing conditions. I wish I had. But,
Now, and Dr. Kwan, you did test Genesis's blood alcohol content.
yes, I did.
And you found a result that was 0.16%.
Right. 0.16% was probably because the patient at that point was in the elimination phase of the alcohol. It may have been higher at earlier in the evening before they came, but for it to drop that low, it wouldn't have been so significantly high.
I'm glad you bring that up, Dr. Kwan, because blood alcohol content does vary after alcohol has been consumed.
Right, and it starts to drop off once the patient stops drinking. You're right. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dr. Kwan, and you actually didn't test Genesis's
sidebar.
I'm sorry, say that again. I didn't hear.
Sidebar.
Yes. Okay, go ahead. I don't know how we do that on the Zoom on this, but you already asked for a sidebar?
Yes, Your Honor.
How do we do that through these type of hearings? Do we just do it with everybody, or I don't know how to do that. I apologize.
To be frank, Your Honor, I've never seen it done before, so I'm not sure I have.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's
Were
just
you
asking
were you
there's
objecting?
asking
Was your objection to sidebar?
this sidebar, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were asking to get in sidebar with me. I apologize.
No.
The objection was you're objecting to defense counsel's sidebar comments. Is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify. Response from defense?
Your Honor, I only meant to thank Dr. Kwan for her answers, but I'll cut the excess. I apologize.
Let's proceed. Okay. Objection sustained. Let's proceed and just move towards the questions. Thank you.
Dr. Kwan, you only tested Genesis's blood alcohol content after you had completed your visual examination.
Well, that's certainly medically indicated. Once you come up with a hypothesis for your patient's illness, then you start testing.
And during that time, Genesis consumed no alcohol?
During the time that he was in the hospital, no.
Dr. Kwan, I want to move on. You also identified muscle twitching?
Yes.
Contracted pupils?
Yes, which is not consistent with alcohol poisoning, right?
Incontinence?
Yes, you know what that is, right?
And low acetylcholinesterase levels?
Yes, low acetylcholinesterase enzyme.
Dr. Kwan, these are all symptoms of liver failure.
Not necessarily, and not in that order. They can be, but there were no other signs of any liver involved problems with this patient, such as jaundice, for example, or liver.
Dr. Kwan, you chose not to run any liver tests, any liver function tests while you had Genesis Petrillo.
Well, of course not, because I was going down a path of appropriate treatment.
And Dr.
Anything, but I see your point, but the most likely thing is the road I was on, trying to get to that most likely diagnosis.
And Dr. Kwan, you also concluded that because organophosphate poison was present in the wine in Genesis' stomach, that meant the organophosphate poisoning had come through the wine.
Well, that test result, if you would review your documents, that test result came unfortunately later.
And Dr. Kwan, I want to be clear that when food and fluid enter the stomach, they mix together, yes?
Well, yes, but they're absorbed so you're right to a degree, but they're absorbed at different rates. For example, some elements are absorbed by the stomach, some pass through the gallbladder and into the duodenum portion of the intestines, where they're absorbed at a different rate. So there is some blending, but I can't give you a blanket yes or no. I hope you understand.
I want to finish by talking about the tests that you conducted on Genesis Petrillo, and I want to specifically talk about that blood test, toxin test. Now, this was designed to test for the presence of organophosphate pesticide poisoning, yes?
It was an overall tox scan, so it looked for all kinds of things.
But it's impossible to detect organophosphate pesticide in the bloodstream, yes?
The indicator, the short answer is yes, but the indicator for organophosphate is.
Thank you, Dr. Kwan. The short answer will suffice there. I appreciate it.
No, actually, it doesn't. But I'm sorry if you don't want to hear the correct answer.
Dr. Kwan, the organophosphate pesticide goes through a rapid hydrolysis in the liver that makes it impossible to detect itself in the bloodstream.
The organophosphate?
Yes.
That's right. Indicated by another test, yes.
And the way you look for it is low acetylcholinesterase levels.
That is correct.
But again, low acetylcholinesterase is also a symptom of liver failure. Yes, Dr. Kwan?
In varying degrees, but again, there was no point to consider liver failure because there was no other evidence of liver or hepatic involvement, such as jaundice.
And Dr. Kwan, again, you chose not to look for any evidence of liver failure.
I chose not to look because the outward sign was not there. There was no point in looking for that when I was going down a more clear path.
Thank you, Dr. Kwan. I passed the witness at this time, Your Honor.
He doesn't want to listen to me.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize she cut out. I apologize. I didn't realize the answer was still going on. Please feel free to finish on my time, Dr. Kwan.
If there's no further questions, plaintiffs, any redirect?
None, Your Honor. We just ask that you excuse the witness.
Okay, thank you. Let's give about 10 or 15 seconds, okay? Thank you. Okay, thank you. Do plaintiffs have any additional witnesses to call?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, plaintiff calls the stand Lonnie Paris.
Okay. Will you please state your name, Ms.
Yes.
Shelby, but Shelby Johnson, I think?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. You may proceed.
Good afternoon. Can you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Afternoon, everybody. My name is Lonnie J. Paris.
And where are you from, Mr. Paris?
I'm from the great state of Washington. Unfortunately, now I live here in Midlands.
And what do you do for a living?
I'm an investigative journalist, but I'm currently freelancing right now.
And why are you here today?
Well, I was called to talk about my investigation into Peony Estates' pesticide use.
So how'd you start your investigation?
I did web searches and I actually found a map of Peony Estates where I actually learned that it's surrounded by a large swamp. And I can only assume that because of the number of bugs at a swamp that they need excessive pesticides for the grapes. So I went and checked it out by taking tours. I started in July 2018.
And what do you do on these tours?
Normally I just kind of poke around, look for any use of excessive pesticide or a bunch of pesticide cans, but I didn't really find that. What I did find, though, was a little bit about the owner from her office while I was investigating for clues.
Well, what did you learn about the owner?
I learned her name is one Harper Martini. She has a daughter named Casey Soto. She's owned Peony Estates for a few years. And, funny enough, I was actually able to see Genesis Petrillo propose to Casey Soto a few days later.
Mr. Paris, throughout your investigation of Peony Estates, did you ever interact with the defendant?
I didn't have any personal interactions. She was usually talking to her employees at the time. But I do remember being in the vicinity of two very interesting meetings in mid to late 2019.
So who did you see at that first meeting?
I saw what appeared to be Genesis Petrillo based on his build and based on his height. I also saw Harper Martini. In fact, Harper actually had this envelope that she handed to the person I assumed to be Genesis.
Did you see that second person take that envelope?
Yes, ma'am, and that was the end of the first meeting, but wasn't the last time that Harper was with an envelope.
Well, Mr. Paris, what do you mean it wasn't the last time the defendant was with an envelope?
Well, the second meeting, that was during a wedding rehearsal, June 7th, 2019. And so I was inspecting this bottle of Cara wine 2019 when I heard some loud and very vulgar shouting from just down the hall. So I went and checked it out, and I found this crumpled up envelope with a note in it.
Do you know what they were screaming about?
No, ma'am, but it did not sound good. It very vulgar, very loud, and very mean, in my opinion.
Mr. Paris, I'm sorry.
I think it may have been Harper, based on the raspiness of the voice. In the second voice, after reflection, I found out it was actually Genesis Petrillo, based on their wedding toasts.
Mr. Paris, was this the same envelope that you witnessed in the first argument?
Ma'am, unfortunately, I can neither confirm nor deny.
And Mr. Paris, would you recognize your picture of the envelope if I were to show it to you today in court?
I don't have my entire phone gallery memorized, but I'd remember that picture.
Your Honor, permission for co-counsel to display Exhibit 24?
Granted. Granted.
Mr. Paris, do you recognize this exhibit?
I could take out my phone and it'd look exactly the same.
And is it a fair and accurate representation of your picture?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, the plaintiff offers Exhibit 24 into evidence.
Any objections from defense?
Yes, Your Honor, I'd object to more prejudicial than probative, if I may be heard.
Yes, please continue.
Mr. Paris already testified that he cannot even confirm if this is the same envelope he saw earlier. He has no knowledge of the context in which this is written. These are not his statements. As such, having him testify to this note, entering it under this witness, would at this point just be more prejudicial.
Response from plaintiff?
Your Honor, even though the witness cannot testify whether or not this is the same envelope, he did testify that he saw Harper Martini with this envelope. Therefore, it is very relevant in this case. And he did say that while he can't attest to the fact that, he did attest to the fact that in this second meeting, he did see that he did hear that Harper was interacting with Genesis Petrillo. And therefore, this was an exchange between Genesis and Harper, and that is indeed relevant.
May I respond to that, Your Honor?
Yes, please.
My objection was not to relevance, but that at this time, under this witness, this would be more prejudicial. We are not saying that these statements are not statements that Harper wrote, but merely that having this witness talk about this exhibit would simply be more prejudicial. He has no probative value to add to them. They're out of context in this case.
Any response from plaintiff?
Your Honor, these further show that the defendant had tense, vulgar arguments, really just a dramatic relationship with Mr. Petrillo, and that supports that the defendant may have had a motive, and this also demonstrates what kind of actions and what kind of threats were made by the defendant.
Objection sustained. Exhibit 24 will not be admitted into evidence at this time. You may proceed.
Mr. Paris, what did you do after you witnessed these arguments?
I went and picked up the envelope. I saw it. I decided to take a picture, but then I heard some footsteps coming and I just ran away. I didn't want to get caught.
Do you know whose footsteps those were?
Yes, ma'am. It was actually Harper Martini. She looked down at this envelope with a letter, said, "I forgot that I should get rid of this," after Genesis threw it back in my face. Then she went and tossed it in the furnace.
And what did you do after that?
I decided to follow her. I saw her actually pick up that bottle of Cara 2019 wine from the bottling area, only this time there was a can next to it, and that was mighty suspicious.
And why did it look suspicious?
Because I didn't see that can there earlier. it had a label torn off and there was actually some liquid in it. I took some for analysis and it turned out it was high in this chemical called isophenthos, I think is how it's pronounced.
Mr. Paris, what did you do after you collected the contents from this bottle?
I went back to the wedding rehearsal and I was able to witness Harper give Genesis the wine. And I was going to ask Genesis about it, but I couldn't.
Did you witness Genesis accept this bottle of wine?
Certainly did. And I was going to ask the next day about it, but I didn't get that chance to.
Mr. Paris, why didn't you get the chance to talk to Genesis?
Because he was dead.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. 10 or 15 seconds, please. 1 second. Okay, defense, your witness, and please state your name for the record.
Yes, Your Honor, my name is Rachel Averett.
Okay, thank you. You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Paris, I want to talk about your methods of investigating Peonia Estates. You first visited Peonia Estates on July 13th of 2018.
I believe so. Yes, ma'am.
You visited again on July 16th of 2018.
That's right.
And this time you were in disguise
Yes, that's right.
and you broke into an employees only section of the winery.
I wouldn't say broke into, more like wandered for investigation.
Mr. Powers, this place was denoted as employees only,
Yes, ma'am, it was.
and you are not an employee of Peonia Estates.
I mean, last I checked, I'm not, but
You also broke into the office of the owner, Harper Martini.
I wouldn't say broke into. I'd say getting my Scooby-Doo on and looking for clues.
Mr. Powers, you had no permission to be in the employees only section.
No, ma'am, I did not.
You had no permission to be in Harper Martini's office.
No, ma'am, I did not.
Despite this, you continued to return to Peonia Estates several times over the course of the next year.
Yes, ma'am.
You continued to return in disguise.
After a while, I actually stopped wearing disguises because eventually everyone just kind of recognized my face. But for a while, I did, yes.
Mr. Powers, on each of these visits, you would eavesdrop on private conversations between employees of Peonia Estates.
I wouldn't say eavesdrop. I'd say intentionally overhearing with intent to investigate. I
Mr.
suppose.
Powers, you would listen to conversations you were not a part of,
Yes, ma'am.
conversations for which you have no context,
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
conversations for which you had no context. You listened to these conversations.
Yes, ma'am.
Ultimately, Mr. Powers, you were actually confronted by an employee of Peonia Estates, correct?
Yes, I'm pretty sure that was Austin Lewis that you're referring to. Is that right?
Yes, I'm referring to Mr. Lewis. And Mr. Lewis threw you off of the property, right?
Yes, ma'am, he did.
This did not deter you from returning once again.
Absolutely not. The J in my name stands for justice, and justice will be sought.
Mr. Powers, you disguised yourself as a wedding photographer.
Yes, I actually was able to sneak in because a buddy of mine who works at the winery,
Mr. Powers, I'm sorry, please finish your answer.
Drew Matsukis told me about the company, so that's how I was able to know to use photographer, and that's how I got in.
You used this disguise to once again overhear more conversations.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Powers, you are not an assistant photographer.
Last I checked, I'm not. I'm still just a
You
freelancer.
lied, Mr. Powers.
I'm sorry?
So you lied.
Yes, ma'am.
I want to talk about on June 7th, the night of the rehearsal dinner. You once
Okay.
again returned to Peonia Estates disguised as a caterer.
Yes, I did.
This time you used the lockpicks to break into the employee-only section.
A lockpick is legal to own in the state of Midlands. I double-checked.
That's a yes to my question, Mr. Powers, that you used lockpicks to break into the section.
That's the answer. Yes, ma'am.
And you talked about and directed about a fight you observed between Harper Martini and who you think to be Genesis Petrillo?
I didn't personally observe it. I just heard a lot of loud, vulgar shouting from down the hall. But
That's exactly right. So you didn't observe the fight.
both, not, yes, I suppose so.
And you didn't actually hear what they were saying?
No, it was really heated though.
Mr. Paris, you mentioned following Harper Martini into a bottling area on direct,
Yes, ma'am.
and you saw Harper Martini grab the bottle of Cara wine.
That's correct.
And the bottle of Cara wine, it was sealed,
I believe so, yes.
and you never saw Harper open that bottle?
No,
You never saw Harper put pesticide in that bottle?
no, I didn't.
I'm surprised you're actually present at the night of the rehearsal dinner, correct?
Yes, ma'am, I was. It was a beautiful reception.
And you saw Drew Matazukis there that evening?
I did. He and I are real good friends.
You saw Drew Matazukis spending a lot of time with Genesis Petrillo that evening?
Yeah, he mentioned several times that they're real close, and so I figured that was pretty natural.
I want to move on, and I want to talk about why you're here today, Mr. Paris. You've been trying to get back into the investigative journalism game for a number of years now, haven't you?
I'm always in the investigative journalism game. That's how I'm here today.
You've been trying to get a job as an investigative journalist for a number of years now.
Well, I have been doing some job hunting, but, you know, it's especially more difficult now because of COVID. But,
Mr. Paris, you've been looking for a job since 2016.
yes, ma'am.
Ms. Paris, you've been hoping to leverage this story about Peony Estates into a job, correct?
I don't think that's true, no. I did get information from Landon Green about digging for a job through this case, but I wouldn't say that my life is dependent on it.
No, my question was that you were trying to leverage this story into a job.
I suppose so, maybe.
If your testimony today goes well, that could get you that job you've wanted as an investigative journalist.
Yeah, Landon Green said that it could, but I mean, my life isn't dependent on this case. I can always keep searching.
All right, no further questions. I pass the witness.
Thank you. Any questions, Ms. Johnson?
No, Your Honor, at this time, we just asked that the witness be able to step down.
Okay.
Plaintiff rests his case in chief.
Thank you very much. At this time, we'll take a 5-minute break. Please remember that this video is being publicly broadcast via YouTube live stream, and in 5 minutes, we'll see everybody again shortly. Thank you. Okay, is everybody ready to go?
Plaintiff is present and ready to proceed, Your Honor.
Okay, defense.
Your Honor, the defense is also ready to proceed at this time.
Okay, Mr. Dean, if you can just text me the scoring judge if you're ready to go also. Okay, fantastic. We're all ready to go. Let's see. Okay, everybody's ready to go. Defense, please call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor, the defense calls Dr. Rose Cannon to the stand.
Okay,
May I proceed, Your Honor?
you may proceed.
Good afternoon, Dr. Cannon. Please introduce yourself to the court.
My name is Dr. Rose Cannon, and I'm a medical doctor with both expertise in toxicology and pharmacology.
Where were you educated, Dr. Cannon?
I earned my BS in chemistry at The Ohio State University. I then went on to pursue my medical degree at Harvard Medical School with an emphasis in toxicology.
And what do you do for a living now?
I used to be the chief toxicologist at Massachusetts General Hospital. However, I am now an associate consultant for Gardner Consulting Incorporated, based out in Beverly Hills.
How did you become involved with today's case?
I was hired by Harper Martini's attorneys to assess the findings of Dr. Jim and Kwan.
Before we go any further, what methods did you use to make those assessments?
So I used a method common in my field, and we're actually taught this method when in medical school when we are having to look over another doctor's work. And the method is called the ears method. So first I gather all of my evidence, and then I proceed to analyze that evidence. And then I conduct my own research. And then based on that research, I select the most plausible of my own findings to include in my report.
Is that a reliable method?
Yes.
Is it standard in your field?
Yes,
Has it been peer reviewed?
it has.
Now, what evidence did you review today for today's case?
So I reviewed the 2 toxicology reports from the hospital and Genesis Petrio's death certificate. I also reviewed Dr. Kwan's official report and Angel Rodriguez's affidavit.
Did you find these to be reliable sources of data?
I did.
Now, Dr. Cannon, what did Dr. Kwan find in his analysis? Her analysis, excuse me.
Dr. Kwan found that Genesis Petrio ingested organophosphate poisoning that came from the wine produced by Harper Martini, and that ultimately led to their death.
Before we go any farther, what is organophosphate poisoning?
So it's a pesticide used to kill insects, and it's actually deadly to humans in certain quantities, but we don't actually know the deadly dose.
And Dr. Cannon, do you agree with Dr. Kwan's analysis?
Dr. Kwan had a narrow analysis of the patient, so they came to a narrow conclusion. I, on the other hand, cannot rule out 3 main possible alternatives when determining cause of death.
What's that first possible alternative?
Given Petrio's symptoms, there are so many unknowns in the situation. I, however, can't rule out that Genesis suffered from hepatic disease, which is also known as chronic liver disease.
Why liver disease?
Liver disease can lead the liver to fail in breaking down the alcohol in the bloodstream. It can lead to symptoms like nausea, vomiting, and even the low levels of acetylcholinesterase, which is also known as ACHE. And all of these symptoms are symptoms that the patient presented with. Had I been the on-call physician, I would have run several liver functioning tests just to ensure that Petrio's liver was functioning properly.
And how is liver disease typically diagnosed?
Typically through a series of regular blood checks. However, since Petrio didn't have regular checkups, we can't actually rule out liver disease with a substantial degree of scientific certainty.
Dr. Kwan, Dr. Cannon, excuse me, what was that second alternative that you mentioned?
That the patient suffered from alcohol poisoning. And Dr. Kwan actually suspected alcohol poisoning at first. Alcohol poisoning can lead to respiratory arrest, which was the patient's ultimate cause of death.
And was Genesis Petrio's blood alcohol content taken at some point during the night that she was treated? He was treated,
Yes.
Excuse me.
Yes. Yes, their blood alcohol content, also known as a BAC, was reported to be 0.16%, but Dr. Kwan failed to note in their report that a BAC actually doesn't remain constant.
What does that mean for today's case?
So Patrio's BAC was likely in decline by the time that Dr. Kwan actually ran the test. Essentially, Patrio likely had a much higher BAC earlier in the evening. It had just declined by the time that Dr. Kwan actually ran the test.
And is it plausible that Genesis Patrio's blood alcohol content was at the fatal level at some point that night?
I think it's important to note that a fatal BAC is different for every individual. So it is plausible that Patrio had a much higher BAC earlier in the evening, and that could have been fatal for him.
Dr. Cannon, let's move on to that third possible alternative. What was the final alternative cause of death that you identified?
That the pesticide entered Patrio by a different way than the wine produced by Harper Martini. When Dr. Kwan tested the stomach contents of the patient, it revealed that the wine contained the pesticide in question. However, we can't actually conclusively determine whether or if the pesticide came from the wine.
Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that the digestive process works is that it actually produces acids and enzymes and mechanically churns the stomach to begin the process.
Do you have a maybe simpler way of explaining that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the way that I actually explain it to my students. So let's say that Patrio had three main contents in their stomach. One was food, one was pesticide, and the other was the wine. So once the digestive process begins, all of these contents actually mix together. And so now you can no longer tell whether the pesticide came from the food, whether the pesticide came from the wine, or whether the pesticide came from something entirely different.
Dr. Kwan, I want to talk briefly about pesticide testing. How did Dr. Kwan look for the presence of pesticide in Genesis Patrio's bloodstream?
Well, it's actually impossible to detect the presence of pesticide in a person's bloodstream. The tests that Dr. Kwan administered only looked for indicators of the pesticide, such as the low levels of ACHE. But even the low levels of ACHE don't conclusively determine the pesticide presence.
Does low ACHE point to any other ailments?
Yes, like the hepatic disease that I mentioned earlier.
Now, Dr. Kwan, we've thrown around the term scientific certainty a lot this afternoon. What does that actually mean?
So scientific certainty actually means that something is more likely to have occurred than not. In my reports, I say that certain things are most likely to occur over something else. However, if I were to actually explain that, let's say that there were four main possible causes of death, and three of them had a 10% chance of occurring, but the fourth had an 11% chance of occurring. Obviously, the 11% one is the most likely to have occurred, but not, we can't actually say with scientific certainty that the 11% one actually happened.
Can any cause of death be selected with any degree of scientific certainty?
No, because there are too many unanswered questions in this situation.
Thank you, Dr. Candon. I pass the witness, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. Give us 10 or 15 seconds, please.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you. Okay, plaintiff, you may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Cannon. Now, you just said on direct that there's actually no blood test to see if organophosphates are present in the blood, but that's not actually the truth, is it, Dr. Cannon?
I'm sorry?
It's not true that there's no blood test to detect organophosphates in the blood, is it?
The test that Dr. Kwan administered only looked for indicators of organophosphate poisoning, but it doesn't conclusively tell us whether it has organophosphate poisoning.
Whether there's organophosphate poisoning, that's right, but there is a blood test to confirm whether or not someone has organophosphates in their system. Is that right?
But again, the test that Dr. Kwan administered only looked for the indicators like low levels of ACHE, which that's exactly what Dr. Kwan went off to make their diagnosis.
Well, you'd recognize Exhibit 6 if I showed it to you today, is that right?
Yes.
Permission to share Exhibit 6 to the screen, noting for the record that it has been pre-admitted, Your Honor.
Granted.
Now, Dr. Cannon, could you read for me under specimen blood what it tells us that the positive flagged results are?
It says the isophensis organophosphate pesticide.
All right, and that would be present in Genesis Petrio's blood, is that right?
If it says Genesis name on it, could you scroll up?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Now, Dr. Cannon, I'd like to talk to you about some of the alternative explanations you offered us here today. Now, I want to be super clear for the members of the jury. It is most likely that Genesis Petrio died from the bottle of wine. Is that not correct?
It's most likely, but not certain.
And the other explanations you offered, those are just guesses, right?
Guesses?
Yes.
I conducted my own research, and I also relied on my own method when putting those in my report.
Well, let's talk about that research. You didn't interview anyone.
Interview? No, that's not typical in my line of work.
You didn't conduct the autopsy?
No, I did not.
You were not the attending physician the night that Genesis came into the hospital.
Objection, Your Honor.
One second. Go ahead. What's your objection?
Your Honor, I object to relevance to this line of questioning. Your Honor, it's been established that Dr. Cannon relied on reliable facts and data in forming her conclusions to insinuate that her data was not reliable because she didn't conduct any autopsy herself or any examination herself is simply misleading to the jury, and it's not relevant to our case today.
Response?
Your Honor, first of all, the bar for relevance is exceedingly low. And second of all, this does go directly to the credibility of the witness and what she's telling the jury today. So it is exceedingly relevant to today's case.
Response, Your Honor?
Yes, go ahead.
I disagree strongly that this goes to the credibility of the witness. Your Honor, it's already been established that she relied on the same facts and data that Dr. Kwan did because she got that facts and data from Dr. Kwan to insinuate that she's less credible because of her methods, when those methods have already been accepted by the court, is only misleading and it's not relevant to today's case.
May I respond on those grounds, Your Honor?
Yes, go ahead.
Dr. Cannon actually was not given access to the same information that Dr. Kwan was, and that's exactly what I'm trying to elicit with this line of questioning, that she wasn't the attending physician, that she didn't conduct any interviews and wasn't able to do the autopsy.
Objection overruled. You can continue with your questions.
Yes, Your Honor. Just to be clear, you were not the attending physician the night that Genesis came in, were you, Dr. Cannon?
I was not. Again, I'm a consultant.
You told the members of the jury just now that you think it's possible that Genesis died of alcohol poisoning. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Also not true, is it, Dr. Cannon?
Not true. Could you explain?
Well, there was no definitive evidence that showed that Genesis's BAC ever reached anything close to a fatal range. Is that right?
I think that it's important to note that Petrio's BAC wasn't taken until hours after her last drink. So her peak BAC was right after her last drink. And so it was constantly declining. By the time that they even stepped foot into the hospital, it was going down.
Dr. Cannon, is it your testimony today that there is evidence that Genesis's BAC reached a fatal range?
I wasn't saying that there was evidence. I'm saying that it's a very likely possibility that her BAC was much higher early in the evening because her peak BAC was after her last drink. And unless there was a bar in the hospital, her last drink was not at the hospital, but at Pino State.
For the last time, Dr. Cannon, just to be clear, there is no evidence that her blood ever reached that fatal range, right?
No.
Okay. Now, Genesis's blood tested at 0.16, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Dr. Kwan ruled out alcohol poisoning pretty early because the symptoms were inconsistent.
Based on her report.
Okay, now let's move on to another explanation that you offered, liver disease. Now, you'd agree with me that Genesis Petrio did not have a liver disease diagnosis.
Not according to what Dr. Kwan reported.
And you don't have any explanation as to why this would have been fatal.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
You don't have any explanation as to why liver disease would have been fatal on the evening of June 7th.
There is a possibility that the presence of organophosphate poisoning could exacerbate the symptoms of hepatic disease, but not only that, liver disease can cause the liver to fail in breaking down the alcohol in the bloodstream, and that can be fatal.
But just to be clear, that's a no. You don't know why liver disease would have been fatal on its own?
Not exactly in this instance, no.
Let's talk about the symptoms that Petrillo was actually experiencing on that night. You'd agree with me that Genesis's pupils were contracted.
Yes, that's correct.
And in an alcohol poisoning diagnosis, they're usually dilated, right?
Yes.
And she was tearing excessively,
Yes.
which is also unusual for alcohol poisoning.
At a much higher BAC, there are a lot of other symptoms that can present, but at a 0.16% BAC that Dr. Kwan noted, that's typically unusual.
And her pulse was slow, whereas with alcohol poisoning, it's usually much more rapid, right?
Typically.
Now, I'd like to talk to you about why you might not want to find a pesticide responsible. You're a consultant at a company known as Gardner Consulting Firm, is that right?
Yes.
And you've been working with them since you quit medicine 6 years ago?
Yes.
Well, you actually have a client known as Detsky Roach and Rodent Killer, don't you?
Yes.
Who instructed you not to find a pesticide responsible.
Objection, Your Honor, hearsay.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor.
Clarify your objection.
Your Honor, hearsay to the statement that the client of Dr. Cannon's firm instructed her not to find a pesticide liable for today's case.
Response?
First of all, Your Honor, I am curious as to what specific statement opposing counsel is objecting to. I have not elicited one yet.
Response?
Your Honor, I believe a statement is implicit in the counsel's question. Your Honor, whether or not the specific words are being elicited here, it's clear that a statement from the client, the firm's client, is being elicited to demonstrate that Dr. Cannon was instructed not to find a pesticide liable today.
Objection overruled.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, they instructed you not to find a pesticide responsible. Is that correct?
I would definitely not say the word instruct, but they did inform me that it would not be within their best interest for a pesticide to be found, but not instructed.
And you're here today testifying that it could have been something other than pesticide poisoning. Is that right?
I am, but again, my client's interest in no way affected my results in my findings.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Any other questions?
No redirect, Your Honor. I ask that the witness be allowed to step down.
Yes, no problem. Thank you. Give us 10 or 15 seconds, please. Thank you. Okay, defense, call your next witness, please.
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Blair Osborne to the stand.
Okay. And you may proceed.
Good afternoon, Mr. Osborne.
Good afternoon.
Could you please introduce yourself for the court?
Of course. Hi, my name is Blair Osborne.
What do you do for a living?
Well, I'm the CEO and CFO of Bliss by Blair, a party planning business that I founded. It's the #1 most highly recommended in the area. It's like my bubby always told me, if you're not first, why bother?
And how are you connected to this case?
Well, I was the wedding planner for Genesis Petrillo and Casey Soto's wedding. I love wedding planning. Really gives me something to do while the wife is out playing mahjong.
And how familiar were you with Peony Estates?
I was excessively familiar. I hosted numerous events there, all of which were a smashing success. I'd been to the locale a number of times.
Mr. Osborne, when were you first contacted about Genesis and Casey's wedding?
The first week of October in 2018, Harper reached out to me and we had a meeting by the end of the week.
What were your first steps in the planning process?
The same as they always are. I reach out to caterers and to vendors, and we got the ball rolling on the planning process. I didn't actually meet with the happy couple until January of 2019. I really wanted to help them out. I loved his name, Genesis. It's like the first book of the Torah.
And how did the planning go?
Well, it was a little bit of a schlep, if I'm being honest. You think bar mitzvahs are hard until you plan a wedding. But we eventually got all the details hashed out in the end, though. It's like I always say, I adore spontaneity so long as it's carefully planned.
Now, Mr. Osborne, you insinuated that this was difficult. How so?
Well, I was getting some mixed messages from Peony. You know, Harper, when she's stressed, she can exaggerate a little, and that's kind of hard in my line of work to deal with. I'm sure you understand.
And let's go on to the weekend of the wedding. What was your job at the wedding?
Well, I was in charge of the minutia of the wedding, as well as making sure that Harper and Genesis stayed as far apart from each other as possible, which was pretty easy because they avoided each other like my mother avoided pork.
Do you recall what occurred during the night of the rehearsal dinner?
Oh, lots of things. Eventually the night came to a close, though, and people were giving toasts. And let me tell you, Casey, she spoke, and it was so beautiful. Such a mensch that young woman is. And then Harper got up and just cavilled about Casey before presenting the entire wedding party with bottles of wine.
Did you notice anything particular about that wine?
I was pretty far away, but I know that all of Peony's wine is of the highest quality, and it just really brought a tear to my eye to see Harper bury the hatchet like that.
What else happened that night?
Not much. On my way out the door, I bid the happy couple Mazel Tov, and then I ran into a few other members of the wedding party.
Who did you see?
Oh, let's see. I saw Drew Matsukis and Angel Rodriguez, and of course the Genesis.
Did you speak to any of these three people?
I did. I looked like Genesis had a little bit too much of Manischewitz finest, so I told her to drink some water before going to bed, and I asked Drew if they needed anything before I left, and they said no, and they were surprisingly not intoxicated given the state of the night, and they were pretty pleased with Genesis' condition.
Now, let's move on to the morning of June 8th, 2019. What did you do the morning of the wedding?
Well, I got up early and I headed to the venue to plan and to get the last minute planning done. And Harper and we chatted, we schmoozed a little bit while I was working.
What did you and Harper talk about?
Well, Harper was telling me that she was so excited that the wedding was going to be perfect, just like Casey had always imagined.
Now, did you do any wedding prep on this morning?
I did. After I put the little tchotchkes together, you might say, I went and I checked on all the people in the wedding party, and I went and saw that Genesis and Angel, they weren't in their room. So I told Harper, and she was deeply concerned, to say the least.
Do you know why she was concerned?
Well, she had told me that right after I said that Genesis, if they ruined the wedding, she would never let Genesis live it down. And unfortunately, that's when we got the terrible news.
What news was that?
Genesis, he passed away. May his memory be a blessing.
Do you recall how Harper reacted to this?
She was speechless. We were all speechless.
Finally, Mr. Osborne, in your extensive knowledge of Harper Martini, do you believe that she could have poisoned the wine to kill Genesis?
Harper, Hashem, no. Harper, she's one of the most decent people I have ever met, and I've never seen anything other than her care for Casey. I can't imagine that she would have done something like this to hurt Casey so bad. Hashem, no.
Thank you, Mr. Osborne. I pass the witness.
Okay, thank you. Give us 10 or 15 seconds, please. Okay, you may proceed. Plaintiff, you may proceed with your cross.
Now, Mr. Osborne, you've worked with the defendant since 2015, correct?
Yes, a number of times. Harper and we go together like this.
And you've hosted 83 events at Peony Estates.
Oy vey, you had the number? Yeah, a lot of events, at least 80.
And throughout this time, you've developed a solid relationship with the defendant.
I would say so.
And you consider this relationship to be more than just professional?
Yeah, we were pretty warm to one another. We've worked with each other for a long time. It's why I was so happy to plan Casey's wedding.
Right. So you and the defendant had such a close relationship, she hired you to plan her son's wedding, right? Or
well,
daughter's wedding.
I don't know that it was because of the relationship. We had worked together in the past. It was more of a professional thing in my estimation.
The defendant asked you to be silent about your involvement in the wedding planning process. Am I right?
Yes, I figured she wanted to surprise Casey with the news that Blair was planning the party.
So you agree that Casey didn't know you had been hired?
Not until I met with them in January. That's the first time I knew that they knew.
Mr. Petrillo didn't know you'd been hired either?
I don't know exactly what they knew, but when I met with them, they had known at that point, at the very least.
You would agree that this request for your silence made you uncomfortable, wouldn't you?
It was a bit odd. I've never been one for surprise parties, but surprise, planning is a little different.
You agreed to remain discreet about your role, right?
I did. It was part of the agreement. Can't ruin a surprise.
The defendant offered you compensation for your silence, correct?
Yes.
Objection, Your Honor. Relevance.
Response, please.
Your Honor, bias is always relevant.
Your
Response.
Honor.
I'm sorry, you go.
I'm sorry.
Response from defense.
Yes, Your Honor. Bias has not been shown within these cases. All that's been shown over and over within this line of questioning is that Harper Martini asked Mr. Osborne to be silent in the planning of the wedding, which shows absolutely no bias in today's case.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Yes, please.
If I may make a burden of proof, Mr. Osborne was offered a 15% higher paycheck than he would normally be paid, and that is bias in his accepting of working for Miss Martini. And it would go later to show that he was more inclined to abide by Miss Martini's wishes.
Your Honor, this line of questioning has not shown that percent change. There have been 5 or 6 questions simply on the silence of Mr. Osborne, which is not relevant in today's case.
I mean, objection sustained, but Ms. Johnson, just lay the proper foundation and line of questioning, and you can get into that kind of stuff. It just hasn't been laid yet at this time, in my opinion. Okay, you may proceed.
Mr. Osborne, I'd like to direct your attention to Casey Soto and Genesis Petrio's wedding. There was a lot of drama throughout the planning of this wedding, correct?
Of course, but I had the chutzpah to pull it together.
During a meeting with the defendant and her daughter, the defendant played a voicemail that she'd received from Mr. Petrio, right?
Yes.
And after playing said voicemail to you, the defendant commented, "One of these days, Genesis..."
Objection, Your Honor.
What's your objection?
Hearsay as to the voicemail.
Response?
Your Honor, we're not using this for the truth of the matter asserted. We merely are focused on the effect it had on the listener, the defendant. We don't care what the voicemail says. We just care what it prompted her to say.
Response from defense?
In that case, I take back my objection.
Okay, you may proceed. Objection overruled.
So, Mr. Osborne, I'm going to go ahead and repeat the question.
Please do. My memory, it's not what it used to be.
After playing that voicemail, the defendant commented, "One of these days, Genesis will drink the wrong thing and it will kill Genesis," correct?
She did say that. It's like I said, stressed Harper says some things.
Now, it's true that you attended Miss Soto's and Mr. Petrio's rehearsal dinner?
Yes, I was the party planner. Of course I was there.
And at the end of the dinner, the defendant gifted Mr. Petrio with a bottle of wine from Peony Estates.
Yes.
And after giving this gift, the defendant instructed Petrio not to open it in front of other people.
I was pretty far away. I don't remember the specifics, but I feel like that might have happened.
The defendant told Mr. Petrio that the wine was only meant for him, right?
It was for a special time alone. You can only enjoy the best wines when you're alone, and I think that's what Harper was trying to say.
The defendant instructed Mr. Petrio to reflect on everything that he had done upon opening the wine.
It was a beautiful gesture. Yes, so beautiful, so moving.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Okay. Anything for redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. I ask that my witness be allowed to step down.
Okay, granted. Give us about 10 seconds. Thank you. Okay. Does defense have any other witness to call?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Harper Martini to the stand.
Okay. You may proceed.
Good evening. Could you please introduce yourself to the court? My name is Harper Martini. What do you do for a living, Ms. Martini?
I actually own Peony Estates.
I'm
I opened it back
sorry.
in
Can you give me 1 second? I'm sorry that your audio, Miss Martini, is very low. I don't know if I can hardly hear you. If you can, I don't know if I'm the only one having that, but you could raise it up a little bit, please.
Is that better?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you. If you can start again, please. Sorry.
Yes, Your Honor. Could you please introduce yourself?
I'm Harper Martini.
What do you do for a living, Ms. Martini?
I actually own Peony Estates Winery here in Midlands, and I opened it up back in 2015.
Could you tell us a little bit about Peony Estates and how it got started?
Of course, while I grew up around wine my entire life, which isn't the best way to describe your childhood, but my grandparents were in the industry, and I followed in their footsteps. So I opened Peony Estates. Now it's bed and breakfast, it's a winery, we give tours, you name it, we probably do it.
Do you run Peony Estates all by yourself?
It's actually run by myself, another employee named Austin Lewis, and Drew Matsukas. We really are dedicated to providing our guests with awesome experiences.
Ms. Martini, are you familiar with the events of June 8th of 2019?
Yeah, it really is a shame what happened to Genesis, and I've never seen my dear sweet Casey that heartbroken.
Ms. Martini, who is Casey?
Casey's my daughter, and Genesis was her fiance. They were supposed to be getting married that weekend.
When did Casey and Genesis get engaged?
Well, they got engaged after they had met in grad school. One of my employees, Drew, actually helped Genesis propose.
Did you know Genesis personally?
I did, and I'll be honest, we never really got along. But Genesis made my daughter happy, and I had to come to terms with that. But I did have some concerns about Genesis.
What were some of those concerns?
You know, I really second guessed his devotion to Casey, and he seemed like a bad influence on her. And I mean, someone like Drew would have been a much better fit for my Casey. I mean, they were best friends for a really long time. They even dated for a little bit.
Ms. Martini, I want to move on and talk about the events of the wedding weekend, all right? How did that weekend start for you?
It actually started on June 6th for me. You know, Casey very kindly asked me to share a glass of wine with her, and we had a really nice conversation.
What did the two of you talk about?
It was the nitty gritty of the wedding, you know, what napkins they chose, the tablecloths, their vows, what have you. But it was that conversation that made me realize how badly I needed to bury the hatchet with Genesis.
Did you bury the hatchet with Genesis?
I did. That's actually what led into June 7th.
What do you mean by that?
Well, back when the wedding planning was still going around, I remember the kind of wine that Genesis really took a liking to, and Peony Estates was coming out with something very similar.
What wine are you referring to?
It was the Cara wine. It was a 3-blend wine, very fruitful. We were really, really excited to roll it out, and I figured who better than Genesis to have the first bottle as a peace offering.
Did you give that bottle to Genesis?
I did. I gave it to Genesis the night of June 7th, 2019 at around 10 p.m.
Can you tell us about the time you gave Genesis the bottle?
Of course. Everyone was giving toasts. I handed Genesis the Cara bottle. Everyone else got a bottle of Horizon. I really wanted this to be the start of a new relationship for Genesis and I, because I knew how much they meant to Casey, and Casey meant the world to me.
Ms. Martini, what did you do after you gave Genesis the bottle of wine?
Well, I kindly excused myself. You know, I didn't want to be out here being a helicopter parent while the kids were having fun. So I attended to other matters at the winery.
Are you aware of who Genesis was with the night of the rehearsal dinner?
I saw Genesis primarily with Angel and with Drew. I felt kind of bad for Drew.
Ms. Martini, why do you say you felt bad for Drew?
Well, in the past few weeks before the rehearsal dinner, Drew's behavior confirmed what I had always suspected. Drew still had feelings for Casey.
What behavior are you referring to?
After Drew helped Genesis plan with the proposal, he started picking up extra shifts at the winery. He'd give tours all the time. He'd stay late to clean. He was really preoccupying himself with the work at the winery.
Was there anything else that made you feel bad for him?
Well, I actually ran into him in the bottling area the night before the rehearsal dinner when I was going to close Peony Estates up for the day.
Did you interact with Drew at this point?
Yeah, Drew's back was turned to me, and it looked like he'd been crying. I've never seen him in that shape before. So I asked him what he was doing there so late, and I asked what he was doing there alone. He quickly turned around. There was a can of Bug Off at his feet, and the bottle of Cara wine was on a table right in front of him. Now all my employees know what the policy and the protocol is for pesticides, so I kindly reminded him to dispose of those before he left for the day. And when I went to go grab the Cara in the morning, the pesticide was gone.
All right, now, Ms. Martini, I want to go back and talk about the rehearsal dinner again. Did anything happen after you went to bed?
I got a call from Austin Lewis around 2:30 in the morning.
Why was Austin calling you?
Somebody from Peony Estates had been rushed to the hospital.
Did you find out who'd been rushed to the hospital?
Well, I went to go check on the rooms because I suspected it might have been one of the wedding guests, and it was actually Genesis.
What makes you say that it was Genesis?
When I walked into Genesis's room, the bottle of Cara was on the ground and it was completely empty. I picked up the bottle, I ripped off the label, and I threw it away out of frustration. I can't believe Genesis ruined my daughter's one and only wedding day.
Ms. Martini, are you aware that the bottle of Cara wine that was thrown away later tested positive for the presence of pesticides?
Yes, and I have no idea how that could have happened. Maybe the dumpster, but that's the only thing I can think of.
What do you mean, maybe the dumpster?
Well, as a preemptive approach to the wedding, we went ahead and sprayed everything down to make sure we were ready for the wedding. We had a couple of cans of pesticides that were still a little full, but too empty to use, so we disposed of those as we always do in the dumpster. And the bottle of Cara that I had thrown away also found its way to the dumpster once the trash was taken out.
Ms. Martini, is it possible that someone tampered with the bottle of Cara wine before it was thrown away?
Oh, no, none of my employees would have done that.
Where did you store the bottle of Cara wine before giving it to Genesis?
It was in the bottling area until the night of the rehearsal dinner.
Ms. Martini, is this the same bottling area where you saw Drew Matsoukas the night of the rehearsal dinner?
Yes, we only have the one bottling area.
Ms. Martini, who knew that that bottle was intended for Genesis?
Well, I let all of my employees know, since it was the first bottle, I didn't want someone to accidentally sell it or have somebody sample it. I wanted to make sure that the bottle was unopened, still corked, and the glass had integrity.
Ms. Martini, were there any security measures in place to protect someone from accessing that bottle?
No, it's not like the bottle was under a lock and key or anything. It was just there on the shelf.
Finally, Ms. Martini, would you ever hurt Genesis on purpose?
No. I know that Genesis and we had our moments. We didn't get along for the longest time. But I saw how much Genesis meant to Casey, and Casey meant a lot to me. I did my best to bury the hatchet, and I promise I would never have hurt Genesis like that.
Thank you, Ms. Martini. Pass the witness.
Okay, give about 10 seconds, please. Okay, plaintiff, you ready for cross? You may proceed.
Good afternoon, Ms. Martini.
Good afternoon.
Let's talk about your relationship with your child, Casey Soto, and her partner, Genesis Petrillo. You'd say, overall, you had a very good relationship with your daughter, Casey Soto.
Yeah, I would hope so. I really loved her.
However, you thought that Miss Soto's only flaw was the relationship with Petrillo?
I didn't think Genesis was the best influence on her, yeah.
Which is why you thought it was her only flaw, right?
Yes.
In fact, you wish that Casey Soto and Genesis Petrillo never met.
Yes, I did say that at one point, but I think having that conversation with Casey really changed my mind.
And in fact, you hated Petrillo so much that you wanted him out of your life for good?
For the longest time, I did hold a lot of hostility towards him, yes.
This is partly because you were scared that Miss Soto wouldn't take over your winery in the future if she was with Petrillo?
Yes, and I was afraid that Genesis was going to take Casey away from me.
Yeah, and then you aired your concerns about Petrillo to your daughter, and she brushed them aside, right?
Yes,
And despite this, against your own wishes, your daughter Soto was still planning on marrying Genesis Petrillo.
she was.
And she even said she didn't want you at the wedding.
She said that if I couldn't cooperate, she didn't want me at the wedding.
Now let's talk about the night of June 6th and June 7th of 2019, the rehearsal dinner. The night before the rehearsal dinner, you were fearful that Genesis Petrillo was going to steal Casey and run off to France.
I was, but like I said, that conversation with Casey really changed my perspective on things.
But you were very fearful still the night before, right?
Yes,
You wish that you could cancel the wedding and make Petrillo disappear from the face of the earth?
I did say that, but I can be a bit melodramatic at times.
Now on the morning of the rehearsal dinner, you were already angry that Genesis Petrillo had arrived late.
Yes, but Casey assured me that it was no big deal, so I let it go.
And at that moment, you wanted nothing more than for Petrillo to be gone, right?
I wouldn't say that. I mean, I was a little upset with his tardiness, but in the grand scheme of things, it was my daughter's special day, and that was it.
But I'll ask this once more. You wanted nothing more than for him to be gone and the wedding to be over.
I did want the wedding to be over, yes.
During the rehearsal dinner, you led a toast, right?
Yes, I was there for two, actually.
In this toast, you gave Petrillo the Caro wine that you were saving for them.
Yes,
But you gave everyone else in the wedding party the Horizon wine?
yes. This was the peace offering that I wanted to extend to Genesis.
Later at 2:30 in the morning, you got a panicked phone call from an employee about someone being rushed to the hospital, correct?
Yes.
And you immediately assumed that the call was about Genesis Petrillo?
Well, I know that Jen had a habit of drinking excessively, and I was afraid that he had suffered from alcohol poisoning.
Which is why you immediately assumed it was him, correct?
Well, I went to go check to see if it was him.
Yeah, so right after that, you went to his room, right?
Yes, to see if he was okay.
And he wasn't there?
He wasn't there.
And then you found the empty bottle of Caro wine that you gifted to him laying on the floor, correct? And then you ripped off the label from the bottle?
Yes, it wasn't my proudest moment, but I was just so frustrated, and it made me feel sick that he had abused the peace offering that I had given to him.
And then you dumped it in the trash, right?
Yes, sir.
This bottle later ended up testing positive for the presence of organophosphate pesticide.
Yes, I found that out after Genesis had already passed.
And that's the same type of pesticides you use on Peony Estates, right?
Yes, sir.
And as owner of Peony Estates, you would have access to all this pesticide, correct?
Yes, as do all of my employees.
Well, I want to talk about that a little bit. In late 2018, one of your employees, Kirby Doolittle, got extremely ill from drinking pesticide-laced wine, correct?
Yes, sir. That was an accident.
So based on prior experience, you would know that if someone drank contaminated wine, they would not know because this pesticide is clear.
Absolutely, which is why we prioritize being careful.
Nor there is there any smell.
The pesticides have no smell.
Yet, you still kept the bottle of Caro wine next to the can of pesticides?
No, the bug off wasn't next to the Caro wine at all.
Are you sure about that?
Yes.
All right, let's talk about that night some more. When you found that Petrillo was in the hospital, you didn't inform your child, Casey.
No, I mean, we found out at the same time from Angel.
And you felt relieved, even happy that Genesis Petrillo was finally out of your lives?
No, happy is not the right word. I will say I was a little relieved, but in the grand scheme of things, my daughter's fiance just passed. It was a moment of grief. It was a moment of sorrow for all of us.
Is it your testimony today that you did not feel happy with the passing of Genesis Petrillo?
Like I said, I will admit I was relieved, but I wouldn't say I was happy.
And you remember creating a report of this deposition for this case, right?
Yes, sir, I was deposed.
And you were told to include all true and relevant information in the statement?
No, I don't remember being told that.
Well, you were told, right, when making this deposition.
Well, I swore that all the information I included was true and accurate, but they didn't ask me about any relevant information. I'm not even sure what that means.
All right, and you would recognize this document if I showed it to you in court today?
Yes.
Ms. Pruitt, can you please put up the deposition, please, for us today? I want to look at line 357. All right. Over there, line 364, if you can just read along silently as I read aloud. You won't lie that part of you is relieved, even happy that Genesis is no longer in her lives.
Your Honor, I apologize, but I have to object. Time has run out.
Yeah, thank you. That's my last question.
Your Honor, I'd ask that the portion of the deposition that was read onto the record be stricken.
From my understanding, according to the rules, once time is done, that any further questions after that will be stricken from the record. So that'd be granted.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. So at this time, does defense have any additional witnesses?
No additional witnesses and no redirect, Your Honor. I've just asked that my witness be allowed to step down.
That's, of course.
And at this time, the defense rests its case in chief. We would request a brief recess before proceeding to opening or to closing statements.
That'll be granted. We'll give 5 minutes and then we'll return. Okay.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Is everyone ready to begin? Are all parties present?
Defense is ready, Your Honor.
The plaintiff is ready as well.
Okay. We'll now hear from closing arguments from each party. Everyone should please switch back to speaker view. All right, I see that. Thank you, Mr. Dean. Mr. Dean's ready also. You all see your time remaining. I'm looking at there. I don't know. So please be aware of that. Plaintiff, it's your burden. You may proceed whenever ready.
May it please the court. Harper Martini did what she said she would. Your wedding day is supposed to be the happiest, most memorable day of your entire life. Unfortunately, for Ms. Casey Soto and Mr. Genesis Petrillo, that day never materialized. All thanks to the vile actions of the defendant, Ms. Harper Martini. Members of the jury, if there's anything I want you to take away from this trial, it's that Harper Martini, like I saw once again, did what she said she would. And this relationship between the defendant, Ms. Martini, and the late Mr. Genesis Petrillo was one of deep, pure hatred. That is why we are here today in the case of Petrillo v. Martini, where we, the plaintiff, represent the estates of Genesis Petrillo and are accusing the defendant, Ms. Harper Martini, of battery in the death of her child's future spouse, Mr. Genesis Petrillo. Now, as the plaintiff, we hold the burden of proof in today's case. We must prove, based on the preponderance of the evidence, that Ms. Martini is indeed liable of battery in Genesis Petrillo's death. Now, this does not mean that you have to be 100% convinced that it was Ms. Martini who actually committed this battery. As long as you believe that it's more likely than not that she committed these actions, based on the evidentiary standard, you will hold her liable for her actions. And throughout this entire trial, we've proved all three elements required to sustain and hold her accountable. We've proven that Ms. Martini committed the act, Ms. Martini had intent to cause harm, and that as a direct and proximate result of Ms. Martini's actions, the plaintiff, Ms. Genesis Petrillo, was in fact harmed. Let's go through each of these prongs one by one. On the first prong, Ms. Martini committed the act. The defendants come up here and try to give their own broken picture of the events that occurred. But let me tell you what actually happened. As owner of Peony Estates, like Ms. Martini said in cross-examination, she had access to all the pesticides she ever could have wanted or needed, more so than any other employee on the premise. And on the day of the wedding, as we saw through the testimony of our own witness, Mr. Lonnie Paris, he saw that the empty can of pesticides laced with high contents of isofenfos was next to a bottle of Cara wine. So the same bottle of Cara wine that, as we saw through Blair Osborne, was handed over to Genesis Petrillo. He ended up dying just a few hours later. Then, when Genesis Petrillo was in the hospital, Ms. Martini marched up to Genesis Petrillo's room, opened the door, found he wasn't inside, found the empty bottle of Cara wine on the floor, ripped off its label, and dumped it in the trash. If that isn't something that's guilty, I don't know what is. And simply, the fact of the matter is, if you know that it was simply an accident, like the defense is saying, would you go through all those steps to make sure? Simply based on the preponderance of evidence, there's too many factors linking Ms. Martini to this can of pesticides, to the bottle of wine, to Genesis Petrillo, making it more likely than not that she committed the act. Let's move on to intent. It's no secret throughout the entirety of this trial that Ms. Martini and Mr. Petrillo had a deep hatred of one another. As Ms. Martini didn't just threaten to kill Mr. Petrillo once, she threatened to kill him dozens and dozens of times. For example, as we saw through the testimony of Ms. Casey Soto, the defendant's own daughter, Ms. Harper Martini hated Genesis Petrillo so much, she said, "Leave or you'll go 6 feet under." And ultimately, that's what happened. As we saw through the testimony of their own witness, Blair Osborne, she got so mad at Genesis Petrillo that she said that Genesis Petrillo would end up drinking the wrong thing and dying. And ultimately, only a few weeks later, he ended up dead. Moreover, after the fact, after Genesis Petrillo died, Harper Martini wasn't sad. She felt relieved, even happy. At the end of the day, if that doesn't show intent, that's going to be the biggest cause to show that she knew what she was doing. Moreover, as we saw through Harper Martini's past testimonies, Ms. Harper Martini knew what she was doing when she was putting the pesticide in the wine. As she admitted on cross-examination, through past experiences with her employee Kirby Doolittle, she knew that this pesticide was dangerous, had no smell, and was odorless. Yet she still kept that can of pesticides next to the bottle of Cara wine, ultimately resulting in Mr. Petrio's untimely death. So based on this preponderance of evidence, given Ms. Martini's past statements and her past experiences with the pesticides, we know that she knew what she was doing. Then let's go into the third and final prong, the direct and proximate cause. Now, in this standard, we have to prove that it's more likely than not that the pesticides which was laced in the wine ended up killing Genesis Petrio. And to do that, we heard from Dr. Kwan. And Dr. Kwan's testimony stated that the 0.16% blood alcohol content, which was too low, which was extremely low in Genesis Petrio to have caused that outright, was simply too low to be caused without the presence of pesticides. Moreover, through examining his stomach contents, he found that this pesticide was found only in the wine and not on food or any other substance there. Now, to counteract this, they bring up their own witness, Dr. Cannon. However, the thing with Dr. Cannon is that, like we said and exposed in cross-examination, she wasn't there she wasn't the attending physician. She didn't have any statements. She didn't do any tests or run any diagnosis. She wasn't the one that was actually there. Every single one of her opinions is just mere guesses. Moreover, we're here to prove which cause of death is the most likely. They give the scenario of liver disease. But the fact of the matter is, if it was something as serious as liver disease, it would have been found out years prior. And that is why, in cross-examination, their own expert witness agreed that pesticide poisoning was the most likely cause of death. Your Honor, taking a step back, remember that Harper Martini did what she said she would. At the end of the day, at the end of my speech, the defense is going to come up here and try to give you their own broken version of events. But don't buy any of that, because I will come before you, rebut their arguments, and ask that you find Ms. Harper Martini liable of battery in the death of Genesis Petrio. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Defense, are you ready?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
Yes, you may proceed. Thank you.
May it please the court. They're telling a story with the wrong villain and the wrong ending. Now, members of the jury, when Genesis Petrio passed away in the early morning of June 8th, 2019, a tragedy occurred. No one is denying that. But in a case like today, it calls for a more careful look at the evidence. And it's our job as the defense to help you do that. Because frankly, the story that the plaintiff has told you, it doesn't meet their evidence, it doesn't meet their preponderance standards because they have the wrong villain and the wrong ending. Now, fortunately, the plaintiff can't just come up here and tell you a story. They have to prove it to you. And although what the plaintiff just spent a lot of time talking about sounds an awful lot like a crime, today it's not a criminal trial, it's a civil trial, which means that the standard is a little bit less than what you might be used to. The preponderance standard means when you weigh the evidence in the scales, does it tip slightly more in favor of the plaintiff's story or more in favor of the defense? Now, members of the jury, the plaintiff's story does not have conclusive medical testimony, they do not have an eyewitness, and they do not have enough evidence to meet their standards. Now, they had to meet this burden and to prove three specific things. The first thing they had to prove was an act by the defendant. Specifically, they had to prove that Harper Martini put pesticide into the bottle of Cara wine that Genesis drank. So members of the jury, the plaintiff called no witness that could tell you this was the case. The only witness they could call was Lonnie Paris, an investigative journalist with a habit of lying who was using this story to get ahead in their career. And all that Lonnie could tell you was that he saw Harper with pesticide at some point on the property. Members of the jury, that is not enough to prove that Harper put that pesticide into that bottle. You also heard from our own witness, Blair Osborne, who had access to every part of the winery during the wedding planning, who knew Harper intimately, and he never saw Harper put pesticide in that bottle. Nobody did, because it didn't happen. But there was someone who you heard about that was seen alone with that bottle of wine. There was someone who was alone with that bottle of wine and pesticide, and that wasn't Harper Martini. It was Drew Matsoukas, another employee who had every bit of access that the plaintiff talked about, every bit of motive as well as an ex-lover of Casey Soto. Drew Matsoukas, who was seen alone the night before the wedding rehearsal in the bottling area with a bottle of Cara wine and the bottle of pesticide. Now, members of the jury, Drew is not on trial today. That's true. But the fact remains that there was only one person who was ever seen alone with that bottle of Cara wine with the pesticide, and that person is not Harper Martini. They're telling you a story with the wrong villain, and they failed to meet their burden for their first prong. Now let's talk about their second prong, intent. In an attempt to prove that Harper Martini intended to hurt Genesis Petrillo, the plaintiff just came up here and mentioned dozens and dozens of statements, but I just listened to the whole trial, members of the jury, and I don't know what statements they're referring to. We heard from Casey, who confessed that yes, her relationship between Harper and Genesis was difficult. Harper told you the same thing. But the leap between having a difficult relationship with the person your child is dating and to intending to kill that person, that is a leap that the plaintiff is asking you to make that they have not proved. You heard no testimony today confirming that Harper intended to hurt Genesis. Harper told you herself that she decided to make amends. That's why she gave her that bottle of Cara wine. They did not meet their second prong by preponderance of the evidence either. Now let's talk about their last prong. They have to prove that it was the pesticide itself that killed Genesis, and to do this, they called the doctor, Dr. Kwan, who administered it that night. But when we asked Dr. Kwan on cross-examination, you remember, members of the jury, Dr. Kwan admitted that they didn't investigate liver disease. They didn't investigate alcohol poisoning. They didn't investigate whether or not Genesis Petrillo may have had an allergy that aggravated their response. We frankly don't know. But you heard from the defense's own expert, Cannon, Dr. Cannon. And Dr. Cannon told you that there's no way to know with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that it was those pesticides that killed Genesis Petrillo. She told you that Genesis had been drinking a lot that night, and that before they came to the emergency room, it's possible their blood alcohol content was high enough to cause a fatal episode of alcohol poisoning. These are theories that the plaintiff does not want you to hear, but their medical testimony did not meet their burden. And every one of the prongs that they had to prove by preponderance standard, the plaintiff's story falls short. Taken individually, each one would be enough for their complaint to fail. But together, they reveal that the plaintiff's case is nothing more than a poorly told story. Members of the jury, they told you that Harper Martini did exactly what she said she would, and frankly, they're right. Harper Martini said that she would try to make amends with Genesis. She said she would bury the hatchet. She said she wanted nothing more than a perfect wedding day for her only daughter, and that's exactly what she tried to do. And to no fault of her own, that day that was supposed to be the happiest day of her child's life turned into a tragedy. Members of the jury, the story that the plaintiff is telling you is incomplete. It's one with inconclusive medical testimony, with no eyewitness to see Harper poison that bottle of wine, and with no motive or intent for Harper to do this to her only child. Frankly, it's a story with the wrong villain, a story with the wrong ending. We ask that you find Harper Martini not liable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any rebuttal from plaintiffs?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, make sure you look at your time. You may proceed.
Throughout the entirety of this trial, the defenses like to say the wrong villain at the wrong time. But the thing is, the only wrong decision that could be made today is not finding Harper Martini liable of battery. And in order to distort her narrative, they brought a couple of things out in their closing. First, they try and pin this murder, this death on Drew Matsoukas. The thing is, in order to pin this thing on Drew Matsoukas, they have to prove that he more likely actually did it. And they failed to do that. Harper Martini is the one with the intent, with the motive, and access to all the pesticides she could ever need. She is more likely than Drew to be the one who actually caused this. Then let's go over to the medical diagnosis. They say this medical diagnosis is inconclusive. But remember, we have to see what is most likely. Both Dr. Cannon and both Dr. Kwan agree that pesticide poisoning was the most likely avenue of death. Thus, based on the preponderance of evidence, we know that it was likely to be pesticide poisoning. As we've seen throughout this trial and the evidence that we've seen all over, ultimately, the defense has failed to show that it was more likely than not that it wasn't Harper Martini. So we ask that you find her liable of battery. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At this time, I just ask that everyone stay on. The judges have to submit their ballots. Once we do that, and once we get confirmation from the tournament directors that our ballots have been accepted, we'll come back and do some brief oral comments. Thank you very much. Please stand by. Okay, great. Thank you. I just got confirmation that ballots were accepted by the tournament directors. So, Dean, before you make any comments, just like to thank everybody for having a clean and good trial. Everybody did a fantastic job. Generally, I've been practicing law for close to 20 years, and all of you did a very fantastic job. I was a trial attorney, defense attorney for 17 years, and I'm glad none of you are in the workforce now, because you would all take my job in 5 seconds, each and every one of you. It was very impressive. I'll go to some specific comments, but Dean, if you can go ahead, or I call you Dean, I'm sorry, Chandler, go ahead and please do your comments. I'm sure that you're a young guy. I'm imagining you're a student possibly, so you probably have a lot more specific comments than I do. So please go ahead.
Oh, I don't know. So I will, in order to keep this brief, because I know you all have had a long day, I try and give feedback that anybody really can apply. It might sound like it's specifically directed at one person, but really it's for everybody. By the way, my name is Chandler. I'm a 3L at Baylor Law School. First off, well done on adjusting to Zoom. I've told other groups this. I did a mock trial tournament just a couple of weeks ago before our finals, and you all were reading far less than some of the law student advocates were in that competition. So good job on that. Okay, so just some things that I saw. Talk like a regular person. The biggest offender all the time is "may I be heard," and I want to single-handedly put a stop to that phrase in the next 6 months. It's weird sounding, it sounds awkward, and it makes you feel tight as a speaker and as an advocate, because you think you have to say these very specific phrases. Just speak as you normally would. Obviously be respectful, so show some judicial deference, but just say, "May I respond to that, Your Honor," or something like that. Don't say, "Objection, may I be heard." Say, "Objection, hearsay." And then if there's a need for an explanation, the judge will usually invite that or something like that. Same things with like, "Can I inquire about," or things like that. Just, "Can I ask, Your Honor, how would you do this in your courtroom?" In terms of theme statements, this is not exclusive to this group at all. And this is my personal style, and this is what they teach us. And I know we're towards the end of the tournament, so feel free to take this with a grain of salt now. I didn't love either theme in the opening statements or throughout. And the reason I don't is because themes that are intentionally catchy typically aren't the best, because they can be flipped by the opposing side. And usually the jury has no background information on what's being said. So for example, Harper did what she said she would. Nobody knows who Harper is. Nobody knows what she said she would do. Nobody knows what she did. I mean, that's why we're having a trial, right? So for themes, I always recommend trying to find a universal truth that everybody on the jury can agree with. And then you build that theme off of rules that everybody on the jury also can agree with. And then you find a way to make it, a little bit attention getting, but you don't want to sacrifice agreement and universality for the sake of cosmetic preference, right? You don't want to go for a theme that's alliterative simply because it's alliterative, things of that nature. So again, we're late in the competition, so probably not something for right now, but something to think about in the future. Again, I'll try and keep it brief. I had some other things, but I'll go through the most important. When you are the attorney that's on direct, don't act surprised with the answers that the witness gives you, because the jury knows that you've talked to this witness more than likely before. So it does you no good to be like, "Oh, that's what you mean," or "What do you mean by something like that?" Even the inflection of your tone, even if it's a normal question for the jury, can give off the aura of, acting in a disingenuous way, because the jury knows you've talked to this person before, right? For witnesses, don't feel the need to be incredibly combative, because you lose credibility. And in that same vein, if you don't agree with the question, don't say something like, "Well, yes, but," because what you run the risk of is the attorney cutting you off. So I would always couch it, instead of front loading as a witness, if there's no need, say something like, "Well, not in this case because X, Y, and Z." let's see. So the biggest thing I have is cross-examination. Because that's the most fun part of trial advocacy, but also because it's the most important. That's where you get to tell your story in the most effective way. And this is something that I see, when everybody starts out, people kind of make the mistake of trying to poke holes into a witness's direct examination. And really the better way to go about it is to tell your story through the witness. So you start out with small, short answers that allow you to get the witness to agree with you and get in a rhythm of agreeing with you. And then you go from there, because they can't disagree with you in those instances, because they would look irrational, right? So for example, with expert witnesses, it's a great one, and I'll use the defense expert's